Gluten, as we know, is gluten, as we know, is in all kinds of wheat bread. It's also in breads that contain rye or barley. Those are the three main grains that would contain gluten. And it's the primary protein that creates that really delicious chew and crunch in bread, and also what allows it to rise, because the gluten proteins create a matrix like of strands, and that is what's inevitably going to hold the loaf in its shape whenever it gets baked. That's also if you're looking at a dough and feeling that it's stretchy and has some resistance to it, the gluten has been worked up in that dough, either by being left to sit for a very long time, which will actually build the gluten naturally, or you can add some resistance to it by kneading dough or by mixing it in a certain way, which also helps activate those gluten proteins and help them start to form. So that's what those processes do for our sourdough breads, but as we were talking about in a sourdough starter, also important because we can then see all of the nice little bubbles inside of our starter. Now, this may be a little bit hard to see on this computer, but hopefully you can see that there are lots of nice little bubbles inside this sourdough starter. This one has been sitting out for overnight. That's usually a schedule that home bakers will follow, feeding your starter the day before and then getting to start baking with your bread the next day. So mine actually has been sitting for 24 hours. Because it's a little bit colder, it would be okay to bake with. We'll get to that shortly. But I don't want to skip, after talking about the yeast, I don't want to skip out on talking about the bacteria as well, because they're a really important part of the sourdough starter. Without them, you don't really get the same kind of flavor that sourdough bread is renowned for, right? So earlier I had mentioned that it's not just any kind of bacteria that's existing in this culture. It's actually lactic acid bacteria, or lactobacteria. So by producing lactic acid, they're creating a slightly acidic environment. And that is what inevitably produces the sour flavor of sourdough bread. And that can vary pretty widely. There are some different factors that will affect how sour your bread can be, most of which are related to the lactobacteria and how active they are allowed to be in the process of creating your dough. So there are a few different factors that are very important to know about when you're baking sourdough bread and when you're caring for your sourdough starter. I would say two of the most important factors are time and temperature. Now with time, this one should be fairly easy. If you've ever baked bread at home, whether with sourdough starter or just with conventional yeast, you know that the longer you let your dough sit there, the bigger it's going to get until it actually might start to collapse upon itself if you let it go for too long. Hopefully not, but in most cases, you let it rise to a certain volume, after those yeasts have been producing lots of carbon dioxide, and hopefully you have a lot of nice gluten worked up in there so that it traps those gases and gives you a really nice fluffy loaf. So the more time that you give a loaf to rise, usually the bigger, the more inflated it's going to be. And you want to be able to bake it at just the right moment where it doesn't start to actually collapse upon itself, because that's the point where the starter has done its work and now it's actually hungry again. And so it's starting to not perform as well. That's why if you've ever accidentally left your dough out, I know I have, it is not going to stay poofy forever. It'll inevitably collapse upon itself. Now, time is also important because the yeasts are going to keep going and going and going until there's no food left. And the bacteria are going to want to do the same thing, right? These are two living organisms. They both need fresh food to survive, fresh flour. With the bacteria, they are going to be producing lactic acid. So the longer that you let your loaf out to rise, the more flavor you are going to get as the bacteria are producing. So side by side, generally more time means more carbon dioxide produced, and more lactic acid. Now, a sourdough baker's job is to balance these two factors, the rise and also the flavor, as best as possible. And that can be pretty tricky, especially in a place like Pittsburgh, where the weather is changing all the time, because that affects the second main factor in sourdough baking, which is temperature and climate. To be honest, humidity also has something to do with it. It can kind of drive you crazy whenever you're trying to go from season to season as a sourdough baker, but we learn. So at a time like this, when it's winter and most people's homes are a little bit on the colder side, sourdough starters tend to be a little bit more sluggish. Anytime that you're introducing more cold to sourdough, both the yeast and the bacteria are going to slow down. However, this is key. The yeast are going to slow down very significantly. Say if you put your sourdough starter in your fridge to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast are going to slow down to a point where they are barely working. They are not quite dormant, not finito, but they are still eating the food just very, very, very slowly. The bacteria do slow down as well, but not nearly as much as the yeast. So if you, again, put your starter in the fridge overnight, the lactic acid bacteria are going to be still producing a fair amount of acidity, while the yeast are not doing a whole lot to actually leaven the loaf or make it rise. So that is a way that you can play with the flavor of your loaf and the rise of your loaf. You can either extend the time that you want your sourdough starter to be rising and falling with different feedings, or you can also shorten it by actually creating a warmer environment. Because with a warmer environment, the yeasts are going to go crazy. They love heat. And now up to a certain point at usually around 100, 110 degrees, the yeasts are going to be feeding and loving it. Once they get past that point, that's when the yeast actually start to die off and say, okay, I'm done. And that is why whenever we put a dough that we've been working on into the oven, into a very hot oven, usually somewhere around 450 or even 500 degrees, there's an initial pop of activity in that loaf. That has a name. We call that oven spring. And so when you see that oven spring, which is when the loaf, again, just has a sudden, almost like explosion of growth, that are all of the wild yeasts, hitting that higher temperature point right before they get to 110 degrees. The loaf is starting to take in heat. It hasn't reached that 450 degree mark yet, but it is starting to rise. And they're just going crazy. And then suddenly they all die off and the loaf actually begins to set as more heat comes into the loaf. So that's, again, how we get that burst of activity of carbon dioxide in our loaf and what actually contributes to the final loaf. The bacteria, of course, also do die whenever you put them into the oven, but that is their job, that is their role in this whole process, and it's a beautiful circle of life because inevitably you always keep a little bit of your starter on hand and feed that, which will then help you create your next loaf. So by following the model of keeping a little bit of your starter and continuing to feed it, whether it's daily or weekly, hopefully on one of those two timelines, you will be able to keep your starter for essentially forever. There are lots of stories of bakeries that have had sourdough starters for years and years and years, hundreds of years, outlasting the generations of bakers. And it really is remarkable. And there are two sides to that idea that are important to know. One is that, yes, these organisms can be fed continuously, and as long as they're fed properly and, with the kind of food they want to eat and an appropriate environment, they will continue to populate and to provide bread for you. On the other hand, starters are constantly changing. They're changing according to, what is on the different batches of flour that you're using, where are they coming from, what is floating around in the air, what is even on your hands, on the utensils that you're using. All of these are going into your starter. And only the ones that are able to survive in that acidic environment that the bacteria are creating are the ones that are going to survive in your starter. But essentially it is still a changing environment. So to say that it's the same starter as, your great grandparents had, in some ways, yes, it is, but also it is now yours, and it is now a starter that has adapted to you. So I think it's kind of beautiful in that way and represents a lot of things in life that are like that. So we've covered, what is a starter, what are its different components, those that we can see and control and those that we cannot. And now I'm going to move into a little bit of how do we, I wanted to make a quick note about why use sourdough starter, right? Why would we go through all of this trouble when we can just go to practically any supermarket and buy commercial yeast at the store? It's, shelf stable, it's easy to use, it's fast acting. But actually, so those commercial yeasts, I think they do have a place in a home baker's kitchen. Of course, they're convenient, they're reliable, but they don't provide nearly as many of the benefits that sourdough baking does. First of all, of course, in terms of flavor, for those who are fans of sourdough bread and who know that sourdough bread can really span a wide swath of different kinds of flavors and complex forms. It doesn't have to just be, the San Francisco sour flavor that's almost kind of vinegary. I actually don't prefer that one. It can be really creamy and mild with a lovely crust, or it can be, a whole wheat loaf. Anything that is made with a sourdough starter is considered sourdough bread. So commercial yeast just can't do that because it doesn't have that bacteria in it that creates the wonderful flavor. It's just the yeast. That also means that the commercial yeast is working a lot quicker. The strain that was actually produced, back in the 50s, whenever they were selecting this particular kind of yeast, is very fast acting, but it's just the one kind. So it's not going to give you a lot of variables in terms of, different sizes of holes of carbon dioxide, which again is part of sourdough's aesthetic, but also texture-wise is really lovely to have that kind of mixture of, again, complexity. And also, again, flavor within the crust and how the crust forms. There's the digestibility of sourdough bread, which in part comes from the bacteria, which is actually working to simultaneously break down bits of the gluten while we are building it up, which actually helps soften the loaf a little bit. So we still get a really nice big rise, but certain parts of the gluten are made to be a little bit more digestible for us. And so that's why some folks actually find that they can't properly digest commercially leavened loaves, from the grocery store, for example. But they can digest sourdough bread just fine. Some folks they're right on that threshold. Now, of course, there are still people who are gluten intolerant, and they shouldn't be eating gluten by any means at this point in our research on it. But it is pretty remarkable that sourdough can provide a digestible loaf for a fairly large portion of the population. So we have digestibility. There's more nutrient availability, again, from these bacteria and yeasts working to break down different parts of the raw flour and making nutrients more bioavailable to us. They really are doing a lot for us. And it does require a little bit of extra time and care. But I've found anyway that once I started baking with sourdough, I really couldn't see a lot of reason to go back. So that's why we would even consider using sourdough in the first place, besides the fact that it's kind of fun to, get to care for this sort of like a pet or a family member. It certainly is in my house, and get to watch what it does, learn from it, work with it, of course, and get to bake bread the old-fashioned way, because this was really the only way of making bread before the 1950s when we started to commercially produce yeast. So now that we've gone over a little bit of what's different about sourdough starter and why we should use it. I am going to jump into how to actually make a sourdough starter and how to maintain it. So, a few things to consider first of all. Number one, you want to think about, where am I going to keep my sourdough starter? I recommend keeping it in some kind of a clear container, something that's easy to wash, that's not likely to break if you drop it or knock it over. I do really love these like clear plastic deli containers that'll often they'll come with takeout sometimes, or the deli. You can find them though in some supply stores or online. I'm sure they have them around at grocery stores and big box stores as well. So that's almost what I use for my starters exclusively when I'm keeping them at a small size like this. Of course, whenever I'm baking in my bakery, I'm feeding a much larger portion of starter that I'm keeping in almost like a giant bucket. But maintaining a starter, in the off season, definitely love using these small containers, and these are what I've always used with for home baking as well. Another nice thing that I like about this container is that it comes with a lid, and the lid sits very nicely on top, but it doesn't have to close completely to stay on it. Now, the reason why that's important is that you don't want to put your starter in a container that has a top that closes completely. For example, those mason jars that have the like the pop lock lids on top, don't use those because, again, we talked about the yeasts are creating off gases, and that's going to create carbonation or bubbles, and that gas is not going to have anywhere to go. So that can be unhealthy for your starter and also surprise you whenever you go to open up your container and potentially damage the little house that you've provided them. So it's always nice to keep your lid to your container, whichever you choose, just slightly open. With these kinds of containers, sometimes I'll press it down so it kind of locks on about 3/4 of the side. It really doesn't matter too much as long as they have room to kind of breathe, and to also keep it covered so that no dust or bugs will get inside. There are some folks, if you Google search sourdough starter, a lot of people like to put their starters in mason jars because they're very pretty. I don't recommend it, honestly, because again, it's glass. Glass does break. But also, I find that the mouths of the mason jars are very difficult to clean over time. If you're keeping sourdough starter in the same container, there's going to be a little bit of a buildup towards the top of that flour water mixture, and man, it is really annoying to clean. Also, just not as easy to stir things around. This is really nice and wide. I say just go for a cheap Tupperware or something to that effect. But if you really want to find something pretty, just make sure that it's clear and that it's sturdy. You can also cover it with cloth if you don't have a lid that fits your container very well. Cloth is okay. Depending on the ventilation in your home, it might dry out the top of your starter a little bit, but that's usually not a big issue. You can kind of just stir it back in, or even take, if there's a little bit of skin on top, you can just skin it off. So we talked about housing a little bit. Now we also want to talk about where you're going to keep your starter. On days that you're using your starter and baking with it and feeding it, usually you'll just keep it out on the countertop, at room temperature, depending on, again, your schedule and how you want your starter to go. If you want it to go a little bit faster, you might want to find a warm place to keep it. That might be on top of your fridge. Some folks use the preheated oven trick, which is where you actually preheat your oven for 30 to 60 seconds and then you turn it off. You put your starter inside, or if you're trying to leaven bread, you can put that inside, and that provides a nice environment, ideally somewhere around 80 to 90 degrees. Remember, we don't want to go above 110 degrees because that is when yeasts actually start to die off. So just make sure if you are trying to provide a warm environment for your starter, that it's not too hot. And the colder that you give it of an environment, the slower it's going to feed and rise and fall. Now, that can also be an advantage. If you aren't going to be baking with your starter very often, you can actually store it in the fridge. And it's a really wonderful temperature, like I mentioned earlier. Right around that 40-degree mark is where the yeasts slow down significantly, and the bacteria are still going to be working a little bit, but you don't really need to worry about that. You can keep your starter in the fridge for usually I recommend about a week, but you can really keep it up to 2 weeks or so. It might just need a little bit more time to get back to normal because it's going to be fairly acidic at that point. But it's pretty hard to kill an established starter. So assuming that you have an established starter, one that's pretty active, you can store your starter in the fridge. Do your baking on the weekends. All you need to do after you take it out of the fridge is to just give it a refreshment feed, and we'll talk about what that looks like very shortly. So don't feel like you have to be feeding this thing every day. That is my job, not yours. Next thing you have to think about is, what do I want to feed my starter? I prefer to use a blend of white bread flour and whole wheat bread flour. I think this provides a nice mix of white flour, which always tends to, give a little bit more of a rise, more fluff, and just creates more of those gluten strands, which allows me to watch the bubbles form, and seems to be good for my starter. And then the whole wheat has a lot of really wonderful nutrients. Now, I know people who will just use white flour for their starters, just use whole wheat flour. I know people who will use rye flour for their starters, or something, to that effect. Basically, whatever you have on hand is probably going to be just fine. I would pick something fairly inexpensive, because you are going to be maintaining this thing for hopefully quite a long time. I wouldn't go with any of your fancy flours if you have them at home. Something like spelt flour, for example, runs a higher price tag than your average all-purpose flour does. I just like to mix, half and half of the flours. And then you're also going to be feeding it with water. So that I just use Pittsburgh tap water. It's not too gross where I'm at. If you do have reservations about that, of course, you can feed your starter filtered water. But in most cases, I think regular tap water is fine. That's really up to your discretion. And now the last thing you'll need to make a starter and maintain a starter is one really key kitchen equipment. This is going to be the most expensive thing of your sourdough journey, hopefully, or at least of maintaining your starter, and that is a digital kitchen scale. Now, when I used to teach these workshops in the past, I've mentioned that this is somewhat optional. At this point, I really feel like this is a good investment. I've been doing this for a long time, and most of the troubles that people have with maintaining a starter come from not having a kitchen scale and just not being able to give consistent feedings and being able, just that. So these things are no more than $20. They're usually more around like $12 to $15. They will last a very long time if you take care of them. They take, regular batteries like AA's, AAA's maybe. And you can use it for other purposes too. But in sourdough baking in particular, most recipes that you find are going to be listed in grams, not in cups and teaspoons and tablespoons, not volumetric. So if you are serious about trying sourdough baking out, or other kinds of bread baking even, I would really highly recommend getting a kitchen scale. So we have our kitchen scale, and I'm going to show you how to start making a sourdough starter from scratch if you're interested. I'm going to just tilt my camera a little bit so you can see my workspace a little bit better. I'm sorry, I know this light is bright. I couldn't figure out a way to fix that. So I have a kitchen scale, and these instructions also are listed in the handout that will be or already was sent out to you. So if these numbers are going over your head or you're missing something, hopefully if you refer back to that, or if you want to have it out while you're listening to me go through this, you're welcome to do so. But just wanted to let you know that this is this should be available to you. So I'm going to use one of those same deli containers that I house my already established starter in. And the first thing that I like to do anytime I'm starting a new starter or, just changing containers, if I'm going to clean this one out and I want to just move my starter, sort of like cleaning a cage for an animal that you might be keeping as a pet. A lot of pet analogies in sourdough starters, which reminds me, you're going to have to name yours. That is an absolute. So if you are creating your starter from scratch, pick your container, and the first thing to do is to actually find out what is the mass of this container, meaning what gram amount are we going to be working with. So turning on the scale, mine's taking just a second. Make sure that you're in the right measurement. So they'll usually have milliliters, grams, maybe a few other things. Make sure that you're in grams. Make sure there's nothing around your scale either that might actually interfere with the measurement of the scale. And now I'm going to just place my empty container on top, and I see that it is about 10 grams. I say, okay, great. Now I know moving forward that this container is 10 grams. I can either write that on the container or I can put it in my notes somewhere just for future reference. That way, anytime that I want to actually see how much starter I have in this container, I can just weigh the whole thing and then subtract the amount of the container and know that, oh, okay, so the whole thing was 210 grams. That means I have 200 grams of starter to work with, something like that. So now that I know what the mass of my container is, I'm going to hit the tare button. It's usually spelled T-A-R-E, or it may just also be the power button. That will normally set your scale to 0. Yeah, some scales will also say 0. It's something to that effect. So you want to hit that, and that should now set your scale to 0 with your container on top. So if you take your container off, now mine reads negative 10 grams. And if we put it back on, we're back at 0. So now I'm ready to start measuring. When I'm measuring, I like to add my water first. I just find that it usually incorporates things a little bit better. I'm less likely to get kind of like pockets of flour, but in reality, it doesn't actually matter that much as long as you do a good job of stirring everything up. So in the instructions, here in this example as well, I'm going to start with a fairly small amount of flour and water, and I'm going to be adding these in equal amounts. That is the key to sourdough feedings in general, is just keeping your flour amount equal to your water amount. So I'm going to add 50 grams of water, kind of slowly, making sure that my scale has time to catch up. And it's okay if I'm 1 or 2 over or under. That is usually a small enough discrepancy that it's not going to make a big difference. Once I hit 50 grams, I'm going to press the tare button. So now I'm back at 0. And I'm just using, by the way, room temperature or cold water in my case, because I'm not looking to use this starter anytime soon. So I want it to act fairly slowly. So actually this water is on the colder side. If you wanted to activate your starter a little bit faster, you could use warm water, and hopefully that would speed things up, but you'd also have to be feeding your starter more frequently as well. For this, for starting one from scratch, I recommend just using slightly cold or room temperature water and feeding once a day. That's probably going to give you the best results. So cool water has gone in here. Now I'm going to add my flours. If you're just using one kind of flour, you would use 50 grams. Since I'm using 2 kinds of flours, I'm going to add 25 of each. And I'm just going to pour that in here. Yep, 25. And now I'm just going to go up to 50. Perfect. And if I were to go over, now I can just take some of that flour out. It's just kind of sitting right on top. So now I have my flour and my water together in here. I'm going to use just like a butter knife or, some kind of small stirring utensil. You can use your hands as well. I actually really recommend using your fingers to get a sense of what your starter is going to feel like. But if that weirds you out or you just want to keep your hands a little bit cleaner, you can definitely use a spoon or a butter knife as well. Depending on what kind of flour you're using, your mixture should look kind of like a thick pancake batter. If you're using more whole grain flour, like a whole wheat, your mixture is going to be a little bit on the thicker side. And if you're using something like all-purpose flour, it's going to be a little bit thinner. That's just because whole wheat flour is what we call a thirsty grain. It means that it really wants to absorb a lot more water than all-purpose does. That's part of why, if you ever make a recipe one day and decide to add half whole wheat flour instead or something like that, you'll notice that without changing anything else, it's going to be a lot more dry whenever it's finished baking. Okay, so now I have my mixture. The next step to do is to just give it its little cover, and then you leave it for 24 hours. Now, the next day, you're going to do a very similar thing with a slight change. So the first thing you're going to do, now pretending that we're 24 hours later, I have my 100 grams of not quite starter yet, but hopefully one day going to be sourdough starter in my container. So now I'm going to put this whole thing onto the scale, and I'm going to hit my tare button so that everything is set to 0. Now the next thing I'm going to do is actually to take out 80% of this, which means 80 grams of what I've put in here. So I'm going to take that out, and I'm just going to put it into another container. I love these deli containers. They're great for everything. So I'm going to take out 80 grams. And I guess I could do this, one of two ways. Either I can take it out until my scale tells me I'm at -80, or I could have put my empty container onto here and then just measured 80 out. I'm doing it kind of the backwards way, and because I do this a lot, I actually got it exactly. So I now have 80 grams in here, which leaves just 20 grams of my flour water mixture in here. Now I'm going to add another feeding into the mixture of the 20 grams. There's about maybe like a tablespoon or so of mixture in here. So I'm going to do the same kind of feeding, but again, just with 10 grams less of each, so that I reach that 100 grams again, but I'm using the starter that I already have. So now I'm going to add 40 grams of water. There we go. And 20 of each of these. Almost, there we go. And I'm going to mix. And then once I'm done mixing, I'm going to cover it. And after you do that every day for about a week, you should start to see activity, which is very exciting. You may even see it a little bit sooner, or it may take a little bit longer. Either way, you want to keep feeding your starter on the same schedule until your starter is very active, lots of bubbles throughout, and it's going through a pretty significant rise and fall. So whenever it rises, it should rise to about double its size. That's, again, going to be decided partly on what kind of flour you use, but double is about where you want to be. So here's the thing. You're going to keep taking starter out and then putting fresh flour and water in, always reserving a little bit of the seed starter that you have. But you can keep taking the same, you can keep taking sourdough starter out and putting it into the same container of all of this discarded starter. Now, this stuff has a name. It is called discard. And in feeding your sourdough starter and maintaining it, you are always taking out some portion of the starter that's in here in order to give it a fresh feeding. The reason for that is because if you have, say, 100 grams of starter in this container, if you try to feed your starter, you're going to want to give it enough food for all of the organisms that are currently living in here, which means you're going to have to give it about equal amounts of flour and water to the amount of starter that's already in the container, meaning, 100 grams of starter requires at least 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. So now that I fed it, okay, the next day, well, wait a minute, now I have 300 grams of starter. So now I have to feed it 300 grams of flour and 300 grams of water. Next time it's 900 grams. So it prevents the whole explosive growth of your starter and keeps it at a manageable size. Now, the good news is you can use your sourdough discard for lots of different things. There are a lot of recipes online that use sourdough discard, whether it's active or whether it's just the stuff that you're hanging on to in building your initial starter. You can make really delicious sourdough pancakes or waffles. In the information sheet, again, I actually included one of my favorite sourdough discard recipes for waffles. Super easy to throw together. You can do it morning of and just throw them on the waffle iron, and they're really, really tasty. There are recipes for biscuits and crackers and all kinds of things that are just using that discarded sourdough starter. Now, that is just to maintain your starter, right? That taking out, discarding of starter, and then feeding fresh. But what if you're ready to bake with your starter? So rather than discarding sourdough starter, that discard would actually be what you use in your recipe. So after you've given your starter a fresh feed and it's had a chance to rise and it's at its highest peak of rising, which, by watching your starter and marking on your container, however you want to follow it, you'll be able to learn when that is. At that point, you can actually use your starter to bake with. Your recipe will tell you how much starter you will need for a loaf of bread or for 2 loaves or whatever you're making. And then you can actually just remove that and throw it right into your dough. And then, of course, always maintaining a little bit of starter left behind so that you can feed that and, put it in your fridge until next time and so forth. So that is the main gist of it. The continual feeding is just equal parts flour, water. Remember, as I mentioned before, that you always want to feed your starter at least equal amounts of flour, water, and starter. So if you have about 40 grams of starter, you'll want to feed it at least 40 grams of water and flour each. If you were to feed it less than that, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but your starter would just still be hungry. No one wants to be hungry. No one can do a good job when they're trying to work on an empty stomach, and we want the best bread possible. Now, you can go higher than that. Suppose that you have only 20 grams of starter after you took out some for a recipe, and your next recipe calls for quite a bit of starter. Suppose it asks for 200 grams of starter. Well, then you can still feed it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. The yeasts and bacteria are going to love that. They're going to have plenty of food. It's going to take them a little bit longer for them to get through everything, but they are going to be very, very happy. And you'll hopefully be happy too that it's going to be working more to your schedule. So I think that covers, for the most part, the sourdough basics of sourdough starter. I just want to make sure in case I forgot anything here. The discard, by the way, so you can keep it all in one container. Like I said, day after day, you can just keep adding to the same one. You can keep this in the fridge. So as you're building your new starter out on the countertop, the discard can go in the fridge for safekeeping. This is just basically a flour and water mixture. It might start to get a little bit of microbes, hopefully, from the culture that you're trying to create. But it's really just flour and water. And that's why it's totally cool and delicious to use in other kinds of recipes. If you do keep it in the fridge for a long period of time, it may develop a little bit of like a grayish liquid on top, and that is totally normal. It actually has a name. We call it hooch as bakers, but it's excess ethanol, which is another byproduct from the yeast, and it is produced whenever the yeast start to get really hungry. So you basically can just pour off the hooch at the top and then give your, if it was your discard, you don't really need to worry about it. That can just go back in the fridge. Or it might also be time to use it if you're starting to see that on top. If you see that hooch on your starter, that means, hey, your starter's really hungry and it's probably time to feed it. So especially if you're keeping your starter in the fridge for extended periods of time, keep an eye out. If you start to see a little bit of like gray on top, that's totally normal. It just means it's time to feed. If you see, of course, anything else growing in your starter, which is usually not happening if you have an established starter, because like we said, that acidic environment is kind of preventing any other organisms from coming in, except for the ones that like to live in a sourdough starter. But if you see something, pink or green or moldy, it's probably time to, I mean, you can either try to salvage some of the starter from the bottom of your container and put it into a new container, and with fresh feedings, it might kind of come back to life. Or it may be time to start anew and just try again. And that's also just a part of the sourdough cycle of life, unfortunately. But hopefully, it may take a few tries for you to get it, but hopefully you'll be able to get a sourdough starter going, in the next week or two, or whenever you're ready to start. And yeah, just stick with it. And there are lots of wonderful baking resources out there as well. Lots of inspiration, of course, from social media, on Instagram. The libraries, of course, also have lots of wonderful sourdough baking books. If you just enter in the keyword sourdough, you'll find a lot there. Some great places to start. A lot of people will start with Chad Robertson's book called Tartine, spelled Tartine. I think that's a good starting place. I think you should definitely, take that kind of baking and make it your own. I also really love Sarah Owens, Sarahowens. She has written several books with sourdough baking and has a really wonderful seasonal approach to things and uses a lot of really fun flours. So if you're interested in more whole grain baking or just trying something different that way, I highly recommend her as well. And she offers things beginner level and then has some more advanced recipes down the line. So yeah, I hope that was all helpful for you folks. I did want to leave some time here at the end to address some of the questions that have been put in the chat. So I'm going to open these up now. Salt bread. That's really fun. So salt rising bread, I haven't tried myself. It is fascinating to learn about. If I recall correctly, so salt bread is a traditional sort of Appalachian recipe that, its main claim is that it doesn't require any kind of baking yeast or sourdough starter, thrown into it. It sort of just rises on its own from salt and flour. And then I think the key there is to actually use water that has been cooking like potatoes or something that is that may I don't remember exactly what it was now because I haven't tried it myself. So this would not necessarily be considered sourdough because it isn't made from the same kind of culture that we're creating. There are even though every sourdough culture is different, most of the yeasts and bacteria that have been documented are existing in sourdough starters over the world, like all over the world. They're mostly present on the wheats that are growing that then get ground into flour and create our sourdough starter. Something like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, for example, is one of the more popular yeasts that are found in sourdough starters. I say popular as if we have a choice. It's just what's there. But so without these yeasts and bacteria being present as the main actors, I guess it wouldn't be considered sourdough. But salt rising bread is really cool because it is, a kind of bread that doesn't actually require any kind of commercial leavening. You can create it from natural ingredients and pre-existing activity and enzymatic activity in the loaf itself. So that's a really great question. I would love to go back and read about that. It's been a minute since I've learned about that kind of bread. And I would encourage you all to check it out as well, because it is also a tradition of this time. So next question. Sorry, it's a little hard to scroll on here. How often, no, I missed it. There we go. How often do you change your container or clean it? I have seen so many different answers searching online. That's a really good question. I usually, So for home bakers, you're usually keeping your starter at around the same size. Maybe if you're baking several loaves at once, you want to, really create a lot of starter at once. You might go for a bigger container, something like this. But for the most part, you'll be keeping at least your mother culture, or your base sourdough starter, in the same container. I can already see in this container, it's been in here for maybe about a week or so. There's little bits of flour that have kind of crusted up at the top. I think it's really up to your own discretion. You don't ever really need to change your container if it's still working for you. I think it's more about ease of use and to make sure that you don't get those little bits of dried up flour stuck in your starter, stuck in your recipe, because that can affect the texture if you have really big chunks in there. But essentially, you don't ever really need to clean your container. As long as your container is clean to start with and it's not getting infected with anything, and you keep a nice little lid on it. And again, remember, not closed entirely, but just something to keep most things out and gases are able to release. It's not really necessary to do. It's really more about the baker's decision to have a nice clean container to work with, or if you're changing containers based on the size needed, whether it's bigger or smaller. So the next question is, can you change the mixture of flours to the starter? Yes, great question. You absolutely can. You can, we talked a little bit already about how you can use different kinds of flours to begin your starter. You can also train your starter onto different kinds of flours. So if I wanted to create a rye starter, for example, I could start that just from scratch using the method that we went over, but I could also take my pre-established wheat starter, take a little bit of that out into a new container, of course, and then add, I would do my usual feeding of equal parts flour and water, but I would replace just a bit of that wheat flour with some rye flour instead. And then I would increase that amount over time until I'm feeding it entirely rye flour. And then as I, again, continue doing those rye feedings, eventually I will have an almost 100% rye flour starter, just a little bit of that residual wheat in there, but hardly noticeable at all. And over time, it'll be, practically 100% rye starter. So absolutely, you can train your starter onto different kinds of flour. If you suddenly run out of one kind of flour, chances are, if you're just using a different kind of wheat flour, say bread flour rather than all-purpose, your starter isn't going to mind at all. Would you feed the discard before using is another question. Great question. You do not need to feed the discard. So the great thing about the discard recipes is that they aren't relying on the discard for their leavening properties. We only want it for its nutritional benefits, right? Because it probably had those microorganisms do their thing and then they ran out of food and they stopped. And also for the flavor that it provides. The discard will tend to be pretty sour, but the recipes that you use them in will usually have some kind of baking soda in them, which will counteract the acidity, or something else to that effect to negate that acidic flavor, which is part of what makes the whole thing so magical. So you do not need to feed the discard before you use it in a recipe. I believe this recording will be made available to folks. I think it's going to get emailed out. That was just one of the questions we had. Okay, next question. I always heard that when you use a non-stainless steel with mixing the starter or bread, yes. So you do want to, so the question is about, I think, what kind of material for creating bread as well as housing your starter. So you do want to use something that's food safe, of course. Plastic or glass or even ceramic is fine to use. Again, for the starter, something clear so you can actually manage it and watch it. I do not recommend using stainless steel for keeping your starter, because if you are keeping it in that same container over time, the acidity can actually start to corrode the metal. It's not as big of a concern for baking or for making dough with, because that cycle is probably not going to take more than a day to make your bread. And then you're going to wash it, and then it's going to be fine. So you don't really need to worry about stainless steel, in the kitchen. It's more just about housing your starter over time. Don't use metal. Next question is, when we discard, do we normally always leave 20 grams left in the container, or will that amount change unless the recipe would call for more, which we talked about? That's a great question. So ideally, you would want to keep around 20 grams left over. That's just kind of a nice amount to make any size feeding on top of. But if you were, say that you took out, as much starter as you needed, and you were left over with 50 grams of starter instead of 20 grams. Well, that's not really a big deal. We could just feed our starter accordingly, whether with another 50 grams of flour and water, or we can do more than that if we actually want to bake again. It's more just about maintaining your starter at a size that's comfortable for you. So the 20 gram amount is nice because that is a fairly small amount. If you're keeping your starter, for example, at 100 grams at full capacity, right after you've given it a feeding, if you're keeping your starter there just for maintenance, 20 grams is only a fifth of the whole mixture. So it's going to take a little bit of time for it to get through all of that food. So that's why I recommend using that number. But really, it can be anything, as long as it works according to what kinds of feedings you're doing, how large of a bake you're doing, how much starter you'll need. And I think that'll become more apparent as you get familiar with your own baking needs. So hopefully that's just something that comes over time. Oh, here's a great question. Any local places to source unique flour? I have unbleached, unbromated flour. Will this be okay? Yes, I actually recommend, if you can, to use unbleached, unbromated flour. That is the most natural kind of flour you can get. And local places to source unique flours. I know that the East End Food Co-op has quite a few different kinds of flours that are also sourced locally, usually from a place called Frankfurt Farms. That's where I get all of my flours sourced through. That's a mill that's up in Saxonburg, PA. And I'm not sure if they sell directly to the public or not. You would have to call them to find out. But it's great for my bakery because I'm ordering very large bags of flour. They have things like, your standard wheat flours, but they also have barley flour, rye flour, buckwheat flour, things called kamut and einkorn flour, which are two kinds of wheat, as well as spelt. You can play around with those, and those all have different kinds of properties. That is a whole rabbit hole to get into, but I recommend that you can check them out. This might have to be the last question that we do, but any tips on the best storage for homemade bread? So I recommend storing homemade bread in, usually, it depends on how fast you're going to eat it, honestly. If you think you're going to be eating it over the next couple of days or 2 to 3 days, I recommend keeping it in just a brown paper bag. That'll help preserve the hopefully nice crust that you've got on it without it drying out too much. If you prefer, you can put your loaf in a plastic bag, and that'll actually soften everything, which some people prefer, if they don't want their bread to get too crusty, or too stale too quickly. And you can even put that plastic bag and loaf in your fridge if you want it to be extended a little bit longer. Now, one of the best ways to store sourdough bread long-term is to actually freeze it. You can pre-slice your bread and then put it in a plastic bag and freeze it. And then you can toast your bread just by the slice, for breakfast, for whenever, and it toasts up really, really nicely. I really prefer that method. That way I don't have to worry about eating a ton of bread in a few days. So yeah, sorry, I think that's probably all the time that we have for tonight, but I do see that there were some more questions in that chat. I do want to be a resource for you folks, so hopefully I can just look at those questions later, and then in a follow-up email we can send that out to folks if that sounds good.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. I was going to say, anyone whose question we didn't get to, I will make sure I save the chat, and I'll get that follow-up email out to everyone probably this weekend. So be on the lookout for that, which will have the recording in case you want to watch any of it back while you're, following along making it. And then we'll also get some answers to any of those questions we didn't get to. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And a huge thank you to you, Chloe, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I hope you have a lovely and cozy evening.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.